Unemployment has ticked up in South Africa. Releasing the quarterly labour force survey, Statistics South Africa reported that the official unemployment rate rose to 33.2% in the second quarter. That's compared to the 32.9% registered in the first quarter. Stats SA says the number of unemployed persons grew by 140,000 to 8.4 million, while the number of employed persons increased by 19,000 to 16.8 million. Discouraged work seekers decreased by 28,000, down 0.8%, while the number of people deemed not economically active for reasons other than discouragement remained unchanged in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. The expanded unemployment rate for the second quarter decreased by 0.2 percentage points, coming in at 42.9%. South Africa's unemployment has increased from 32.9% in the first quarter to 33.2% in the second quarter of 2025. Now, joining us live for more on the jobs numbers is Johan Els. He's Chief Economist at Old Mutual. Good afternoon, Johan. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, firstly, your reaction to the unemployment rate now increasing by that 0.3%, standing at 33.2% in the second quarter.
Good afternoon. It just highlights once again that South Africa's problem number one is the lack of higher economic growth. So we've had very dismal economic growth, and under those circumstances, it's absolutely difficult to make any inroads in getting that unemployment rate down. What was happening specifically, though, is with somewhat positive economic growth, we've seen that disillusioned job seeker number coming down a little bit. When people actually come back into the labour market, start actively looking for a job, they get counted as unemployed as per the official definition, and that's why the unemployment rate ticked up. But it comes down again to weak economic growth, and so we need to fix that. That's the only way how we're going to get that unemployment rate down over time.
And that seems to be what we're seized with, right? Fixing of the economy to ensure that it grows at a more decent rate. But what becomes of this economic growth or economic growth plans if we've been hearing of the 0.2% that could possibly be shaved off of our GDP with the 30% US tariffs that have been imposed? Where do we start in this whole instance? Because right now we have businesses that don't know if they can export. What will be the support structure that is offered by government?
There's a couple of points there. Of course, the trade tariffs will have a negative impact in terms of our GDP growth, but I think it's not a further shaving of that 0.2% off current forecasts. Most economists, Reserve Bank, Treasury, everybody's already adjusted their growth forecasts back in April when Trump's liberation tariffs were announced on the 2nd of April. So it's not a further shaving. It is impacted. We also need to remember that if we exclude precious metals exports, less than 5% of our exports go to the US. So it's not a significant overall economic effect. It is a specific effect in terms of motor vehicle exports, wine exports, citrus exports. So it will have some impact. But in terms of economic growth, we've done some things correctly already, too slow, of course, and we need to do a lot more. But in terms of the structural constraints on the economy, electricity was a big one, and we're busy fixing that. We're busy getting more private sector participation in areas of logistical nature where Transnet's volumes have been failing. So we've done electricity, we're busy working on logistics, we're busy working on these things, and as I say, we need to do more. But also the cyclical economy is kicking in. Low inflation and lower interest rates, that's helping consumer spending, and to some extent in the job numbers we see that uptick in the trade sectors. So the retailers, for instance, employing more people because we as consumers are spending more. Our ability to spend has been supported by lower inflation and lower interest rates. So there's some signs of green shoots in the economy that we should expect somewhat better growth down the line, thanks to lower inflation and lower interest rates and less structural constraints in the economy. But of course, we still need to do more to lift economic growth from that around 1% annual average over the last 16 years to more towards 3%, which is where we'll start to see more benefits.
You touched on private sector participation. With many of the political parties, even going into election, most of them were talking about the need to involve the private sector a bit more, at least to use their own capital because government is so financially constrained. But that participation is not without opposition, because you still have those that would say that you cannot almost delegate or relegate to the private sector that which is the function of government in most instances. So there's always the school of thought that government has to fund everything in the economy. So what happens now when you've still got that tussle or the wrestling around ideology when it comes to greater participation of the private sector in ensuring that we stimulate our economy?
I think those arguments are starting to fail. Government hasn't got the capital, hasn't got the money, as you rightly said. The private sector has got that ability. So in areas where we all know that state-owned enterprises have been failing, the private sector can do those jobs better and more efficiently and more productively than government. And I think we've seen that significantly in the electricity sector. And now we're building into, as I said, other areas, logistics, water supply, the electricity grid, etc. So more and more those arguments are starting to fail because government simply cannot do that. The private sector's got the capability and the capital to do so. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this growth slump towards somewhat better economic growth over the medium term.
And then the argument that when you involve the private sector too much, we must remember that they solely exist for profit. So in most instances, you're going to see now the commodifying of certain functions, whether it be electricity, it might become more expensive, whether it's water provision, all of those. Does that argument hold?
To some extent, yes, you're right, that the private sector will only get involved for profit motive. But that's where decent government regulation comes in. For instance, in the electricity sector, that's a great example where government and the regulator now wants to open up for competition. Eskom is still resisting that, but competition means you have more electricity available, but they have to compete. And that competition means downward pressure on prices. It's no longer going to be the monopoly that we had in terms of Eskom. And that's where that regulation, better regulation, cutting off red tape, allowing competition comes in, and that will put the downward pressure on prices. So in the future, we should have more electricity available at a cheaper price. And I think we need to keep that in mind.
And then just in closing, taking you back to the data itself, if we had to be more granular now, it showed that at least when it comes to gender, it shows that there's persistent gender imbalances where women continue to carry a heavier share of the burden of unemployment. I mean, they were standing at 35.9% compared to the 31.1% for men. What do you make of just those imbalances that continue to persist? Is it perhaps a stubborn economy that just doesn't empower women?
Is a difficult one. I suspect that with better economic growth, it's one tide that lifts all boats, that everybody will benefit from better economic growth. I'm not sure what the actual reason is behind that diversity between males and females. But that's, of course, a focus that we need to highlight going forward, that when we get better economic growth, we must focus on eliminating that imbalance there.
Johan, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Johan Als, Chief Economist from Old Mutual, speaking to us there.